In a world where outlaws terrorize sacred grounds without consequence, a single act of disrespect can awaken a sleeping giant. When a dedicated nurse's honor is threatened at a veteran cemetery, she discovers that her father's legendary military legacy becomes the shield she never knew she needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine rows of white headstones at Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery. Sarah Mitchell moved quietly between the graves, her nurse's shoes barely making a sound on the dewy grass. Every Sunday morning, before her shift at the local VA hospital, she would visit this hallowed ground, paying respect to the fallen heroes who had given everything for their country. At 32, Sarah carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her scrubs crisp and clean beneath her light jacket. The early autumn air held a slight chill, but she barely noticed it as she went about her weekly ritual. Each grave she passed received the same careful attention, a moment of silence, a gentle touch to the cold stone, and when needed, the removal of any debris that marred the sacred space. The cemetery was usually empty at this hour, which was exactly how Sarah preferred it. The solitude allowed her to connect with the spirits of those who rested here, including her mother, Catherine Mitchell, whose grave she visited last. As she knelt before her mother's headstone, Sarah noticed the rumble of motorcycles in the distance, an unusual sound for this peaceful morning sanctuary. The noise grew louder, echoing off the surrounding trees and disturbing the sacred silence. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she recognized the distinctive sound of multiple Harley-Davidsons approaching. The local papers had been reporting incidents of the Crimson Serpents, a notorious outlaw motorcycle gang causing trouble in neighboring towns. They were known for their disregard for law and order, their criminal activities growing bolder with each passing month. Sarah stood slowly, brushing grass from her knees as she watched 5 motorcycles roll through the cemetery's main gates. The riders, clad in leather vests adorned with crimson snake patches, weaved between the rows of headstones with casual disregard for the sanctity of the place. Their engines roared unnecessarily loud, breaking the morning peace. The group came to a stop near a fresh grave, their boots crushing the flowers that had been carefully placed there just days before. Sarah felt her blood pressure rise as she watched them dismount, laughing and talking loudly among themselves. One of them, a tall man with a scraggly beard and numerous tattoos covering his arms, pulled out a beer from his saddlebag and cracked it open, spilling foam onto the hallowed ground. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she watched them desecrate the sacred space. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, speaking of honor, respect, and the sacred duty to protect those who could no longer protect themselves. Though he rarely spoke of his military service, Sarah knew her father, James Mitchell, had served in the elite Delta Force. Now retired and living quietly in Montana, he had instilled in her a deep respect for veterans and the sacrifices they had made. Taking a deep breath, Sarah straightened her spine and walked purposefully toward the group. Her footsteps were steady, despite the anxiety building in her chest. As she approached, she could hear their crude jokes and casual profanity, each word feeling like a personal assault on the dignity of this place. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm but professional, the same tone she used with difficult patients at the hospital. "This is a veterans cemetery. I'm going to have to ask you to show some respect or leave." The group turned toward her, their expressions ranging from amusement to annoyance. The tall man with the beer, who appeared to be their leader, looked her up and down with a predatory grin that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," he drawled, taking a long swig from his beer. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little nurse playing. Security guard, what's the matter, sweetheart? We disturbing your peaceful morning?" His companions chuckled, spreading out slightly as they sized her up. Sarah stood her ground, though her heart was pounding. She could feel her father's military dog tags beneath her scrubs, the metal warm against her skin, reminding her of the strength that ran through her veins. "These men and women gave their lives for our country," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "They deserve respect. Your motorcycles are damaging the grounds, and your behavior is inappropriate for a memorial." "Sight!" The leader took a step closer, his boots crunching on the delicate flowers beneath. The smell of beer and leather filled the air as he invaded her personal space. "And what exactly are you going to do about it, nurse? Call the cops? They won't get here in time to do anything, and you know it." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to back down. Her father had taught her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up for what's right, even when you're terrified. What she didn't know was that this confrontation would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundation of her quiet life, revealing strength she never knew she possessed, and a legacy she had yet to fully understand. The tension crackled in the morning air as the bikers circled Sarah like vultures, their heavy boots crushing more flowers with each step. The leader, who called himself Viper, took another long drink from his beer before tossing the empty can onto a nearby grave. The aluminum clattered against the white marble, the sound echoing through the sacred grounds like a gunshot. "You know what, boys?" Viper sneered, running a hand through his greasy beard. "I think our little nurse here needs a lesson in minding her own business. This is a public place after all. We've got every right to be here." Sarah's fingers instinctively touched the dog tags beneath her scrubs, drawing strength from the cold. Metal. She watched as one of the other bikers, a shorter man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, pulled out his phone and started recording. Their intentions were clear. They wanted to humiliate her, to make an example of anyone who dared stand up to them. "Actually," Sarah responded, her medical training helping her maintain composure under pressure, "this is consecrated ground protected by federal law. Desecration of a veteran's cemetery is a serious offense." Viper's amusement turned to anger, his face reddening beneath his unkempt beard. "Listen here, princess," he growled, stepping even closer. "We've dealt with plenty of do-gooders trying to tell us what to do. Didn't end well for any of them." The other gang members moved in tighter, creating a wall of leather and hostility. Sarah could smell the mixture of stale beer, cigarettes, and engine oil emanating from their clothes. Her mind raced through possible escape routes, but she was effectively surrounded. Still, she refused to show fear. "I work with veterans every day at the VA hospital," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Men and women who've sacrificed everything for this country. The least we can do is show respect for those who didn't make it home." "Oh, hear that, boys," Viper mockingly announced to his crew. "She works with veterans. Bet they love having such a pretty little thing. Taking care of them." He turned back to Sarah, his eyes dark with malice. "Tell me, sweetheart, do you give them special treatment?" The crude implication in his words made Sarah's stomach turn, but she held her ground. "Every patient deserves dignity and respect," she replied firmly, "something you clearly know nothing about." Viper's face twisted with rage. In one quick motion, he grabbed Sarah's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through her jacket. "You've got a smart mouth on you, nurse. Maybe we need to teach you some manners." Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The other gang members laughed and jeered, still recording everything on their phones. She could see the excitement in their eyes. They were enjoying this, feeding off her vulnerability. "Let go of me," Sarah demanded, her professional demeanor finally cracking as fear crept into her voice. "You're hurting me." "Oh, am I?" Viper sneered, tightening his grip further. "Funny how that works. You hurt my feelings, I hurt your arm. Seems fair to me." The gang member with the phone moved closer, making sure to capture every moment of her distress. "Come on, nurse," he taunted. "Give us a smile for the camera. This is going straight to social media." Sarah's mind flashed to her father, wondering what he would do in this situation. James Mitchell had always taught her to avoid violence, to use her words and wit first. But he had also taught her about standing up to bullies, about not letting fear paralyze you when facing adversity. "You're making a mistake," she warned, her voice low and controlled despite the pain in her arm. "You don't want to do this." Viper laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, but I think we do. Boys, what do you say we show this little nurse what happens when someone tries to tell the Crimson Serpents what to do?" The other gang members moved in closer, their intentions clear in their predatory grins. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the situation was spiraling out of control. The peaceful cemetery had become a trap, and she was surrounded by men who had no respect for the law, let alone the sanctity of this place. In that moment, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the white headstones, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. These men might think they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who she really was, or more importantly, who her father was. The very ground they stood on held the remains of warriors, and she was the daughter of one of the most decorated Delta Force operators in recent history. What the Crimson Serpents didn't know was that they weren't just threatening a nurse. They were about to awaken a legacy of military excellence that had been quietly sleeping beneath the surface of her civilian life. As Viper's grip tightened further, Sarah knew this confrontation was about to take a turn that none of them expected. In a flash of movement that surprised even Sarah, Viper yanked her closer, causing her to stumble forward onto the hallowed ground. The impact sent a jolt through her knees as she caught herself, her hands pressing against the cold earth between the graves. The gang's laughter echoed across the cemetery, mixing with the sound of their phones recording her humiliation. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Viper sneered, his boot deliberately crushing another bouquet of flowers left by a grieving family. "Look at her, boys. Little nurse thinking she can tell us what to do, now on her knees where she belongs." Sarah felt the sting of tears threatening to form, but she refused to let them fall. The morning dew had soaked through her scrubs where she knelt, and she could feel the dampness against her skin. The indignity of the moment burned through her, not just for herself, but for everything this sacred place represented. "Those flowers," she said, her voice trembling with anger rather than fear, "were left by a 6-year-old girl for her father yesterday. I watched her place them there myself." "Oh, isn't that sweet?" one of the other gang members mocked, moving his phone closer to capture her face. "Maybe she can bring some more for us to step on. Give us something else to record." The casual cruelty of their words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of all the families she'd watched come through these gates, wives, children, parents, all carrying their grief with quiet dignity. Now these men were desecrating not just the grounds, but the very memory of the fallen. Viper reached down and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His fingers were rough against her skin, calloused and dirty. "You know what would make a great video? Watching Miss Perfect Nurse here clean up our mess. What do you say, boys? Should we give her something to really clean up?" The gang members responded by pulling out more beer cans from their saddlebags, the aluminum glinting in the morning sun. Sarah watched in horror as they began opening them, the intention clear in their malicious grins. She could smell the alcohol on Viper's breath as he leaned down closer to her face. "This is your last chance to apologize," he growled. "Beg for forgiveness, and maybe we'll only make you watch while we have our fun." Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could see her phone in her jacket pocket, just out of reach. The cemetery gates were too far to run, and even if she could, she wouldn't leave these men here to continue their desecration. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes, Butterfly, standing your ground means taking a hit. I will not apologize," she said, each word clear and deliberate, "not to men like you who have no respect for the heroes buried here." The first splash of beer hit her directly in the face, the cold liquid running down her neck and soaking into her scrubs. The gang whooped and cheered, their phones capturing every moment of her humiliation. Another can's contents struck her shoulder, then another her back. Sarah remained on her knees, her hands clenched into fists against the earth. Each splash of beer felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of every service member resting. In these grounds, the dog tags beneath her soaked scrubs felt like they were burning against her skin, her father's strength somehow flowing through the metal into her heart. "Look at her just taking it," one of the gang members laughed. "Maybe. She likes it, boys." Viper grabbed a handful of her hair, forcing her head back. "Not so professional now, are you? Where's all that big talk about respect and dignity?" Sarah met his gaze, and something in her eyes made him pause. Despite the beer dripping down her face, despite her soaked uniform and compromised position, there was steel in her expression, the same steel that had carried her through long nights in the emergency room, through the death of her mother, through every hardship she'd faced. "My father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a weight that made even the gang members lean in to hear, "taught me that dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's something you carry inside." "Your father?" Viper scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "What's Daddy gonna do about it? Call the cops? Write an angry letter?" Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her, even as another splash of beer hit her back. These men thought they were breaking her, but with each act of degradation, they were only proving their own weakness. She thought of her father, of the quiet strength he carried, of the lessons he'd taught her about standing up to bullies. "My father," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "always said that true strength isn't about how much power you have. It's about how you use it." The gang's laughter faltered slightly at the conviction in her voice. Even as she knelt there, soaked and surrounded, something about her demeanor had shifted. The morning sun caught the metal of her father's dog tags, now visible through her wet scrubs, sending a glint of light across the graves. The laughter and jeers of the Crimson Serpents echoed through the sacred grounds as Sarah remained on her knees, beer dripping from her hair and scrubs. She could feel the dampness seeping through to her skin, but it wasn't the cold that made her tremble. It was the rage building inside her, a quiet storm gathering strength. Retreating footsteps caught her attention as one of the gang members walked over to his motorcycle, rummaging through a saddlebag. "Hey, Viper," he called out, "got something that'll make this even better." He returned with a can of spray paint, the metal ball rattling inside as he shook it. Sarah's heart dropped as she realized their intentions. "Don't," she warned, her voice carrying an edge that surprised even her. "You've done enough damage." Viper yanked her hair again, forcing her to watch as his companion approached a nearby headstone. "What's wrong, nurse? Don't want us leaving our mark, making sure everyone knows the serpents were here?" The sound of the spray can's nozzle cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Sarah watched in horror as red paint began to mar the pristine white marble of a soldier's final resting place. The gang members laughed and cheered, passing the can around as they moved from stone to stone, desecrating each with their gang symbol. Sarah closed her eyes, unable to watch the desecration. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, from a rare moment when he'd spoken about his service. "The hardest part of combat isn't the fighting, butterfly. It's watching something sacred being destroyed and knowing you have to wait for the right moment to act." The right moment. Sarah forced herself to focus through her anger and humiliation. She needed to get to her phone to document what was happening. These men weren't just bullies. They were criminals, and she needed evidence. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight, making it appear as though she was simply adjusting her position. Her hand inched toward her jacket pocket where her phone rested. The gang members were distracted now, caught up in their vandalism, their phones lowered as they took turns with the spray paint. "You know what would be really funny?" one of them called out. Let's give her a makeover too. Red's definitely her color. Fresh fear surged through Sarah as she heard the spray can being shaken again. Her fingers finally closed around her phone, and with movements practiced through years of careful patient care, she managed to slip it partly out and activate the camera. "Hold her still," Viper commanded, his grip on her hair tightening. "Make sure you get this on video. It'll teach anyone else who thinks about standing up to us." As the gang member with the spray paint approached, Sarah knew she had to act. With deliberate movements, she positioned her phone, using their own arrogance against them. They were so focused on humiliating her that they didn't notice she was recording everything. The cold mist of paint hit her cheek, and Sarah couldn't hold back a gasp. The chemical smell burned her nose, mixed with the lingering scent of beer and motorcycle exhaust. She could feel the paint running down her neck, staining her skin and uniform with their cruel mark. "There we go," Viper laughed. "Now you're branded. Everyone will know what happens when you mess with the Serpents." Sarah thought of her patients at the VA hospital, proud men and women who had served their country with honor, who now fought daily battles with injuries, both visible and hidden. She thought of her father, who had taught her that true strength came from standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "You think this makes you powerful?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain and humiliation. "Attacking a nurse? Vandalizing graves? This just proves how weak you really are." The spray paint stopped abruptly. Viper's grip tightened painfully. In her hair. "What did you just say?" "I said you're weak," Sarah repeated, each word clear and deliberate. "Real men don't need to destroy sacred places to feel strong. Real men don't attack women to prove their worth." The tension in the air shifted, becoming dangerous, electric. Sarah could feel the anger radiating from the gang members, but she kept going. She needed them to focus on her words, to stay distracted while her phone continued recording. "You think a little paint and beer makes you tough," she continued. "I've watched real warriors fight through pain you couldn't imagine. I've held their hands as they recovered from wounds that would break you. You're nothing compared to the heroes buried here." Viper's face contorted with rage. He released her hair, only to grab her throat, his fingers pressing against her windpipe. "You've got a real death wish, don't you, nurse? Nobody talks to me like that. Nobody." Sarah met his gaze steadily, even as spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. She thought of her father again, of all the times he'd told her that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and standing your ground anyway. As Sarah struggled to breathe beneath Viper's grip, a distant sound cut through. The morning air, the rumble of another motorcycle approaching. The gang members exchanged nervous glances, their bravado momentarily shaken by the unexpected arrival. "Probably just some weekend rider," one of them muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The sound grew louder, more purposeful, different from their own bike's chaotic roar. This was the controlled approach of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Viper's grip on Sarah's throat loosened slightly as he turned toward the noise. She gasped for air, her hand still carefully concealing her phone, making sure to capture everything. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw a single headlight emerge from the morning mist. The motorcycle that appeared was unlike the gang's flashy choppers. It was a dark, military-style bike, its rider dressed in black riding gear, that spoke of functionality rather than show. The engine's rumble dropped to a low idle as the rider came to a stop several yards away. "Just some old timer," Viper sneered, though Sarah noticed his hand had completely released her throat. "Probably here for his morning cry at some buddy's grave. Mind your own business, old man." The rider cut the engine, but remained seated, observing the scene before him. Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze, taking in everything. The desecrated graves, her paint and beer-soaked uniform, the gang members with their phones and spray cans. "I said move along," Viper shouted, but there was a tremor in his voice now. Something about the rider's stillness, his silent assessment of the situation, had triggered a primitive warning in the gang leader's mind. Finally, the rider swung his leg over the bike and stood. He was tall, his movements fluid, despite his age, suggesting years of tactical training. As he removed his helmet, Sarah's heart leaped. She recognized the silver hair, the weathered face, the piercing blue eyes that had always seemed to see right through any deception. "Dad!" she whispered, relief and worry mixing in her chest. She hadn't expected him. He was supposed to be in Montana, hundreds of miles away. Yet here he stood, like an avenging angel materializing from the morning mist. James Mitchell placed his helmet carefully on his bike's seat, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was dressed in simple riding gear, but he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a warrior. His eyes moved from Sarah to the gang members, cataloging faces, positions, threats. "That's your dad?" Viper laughed, but it sounded forced. "What's he gonna do? Call the cops on us? We'll be long gone before they show up." James took a single step forward, and despite themselves, the gang members took a collective step back. There was something in his presence, a contained violence that made their petty displays of aggression seem childish in comparison. "You know," James said, his voice quiet but carrying across the cemetery with deadly clarity, "in all my years of service, I've dealt with a lot of bullies. They all have one thing in common." He took another step forward. "They're cowards who prey on those they think can't fight back." "Listen, old man," Viper started, but James cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "No, you listen," James continued, his voice taking on an edge that made Sarah shiver despite herself. "That's my daughter you're manhandling. Those are my brothers and sisters in arms, whose graves you're desecrating. And you've made a very, very serious mistake." One of the gang members, braver or perhaps more foolish than the others, stepped forward. "There's 5 of us and 1 of you, old-timer. Those odds don't look good for—" Before he could finish his sentence, James moved. It was like watching water flow, smooth, natural, inevitable. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance and swept, the gang member's legs out from under him. The man hit the ground with a heavy thud, the air rushing from his lungs. "Anyone else want to discuss odds?" James asked, his stance relaxed but ready. Sarah could see it now, the Delta Force operator emerging from beneath the retired veteran's exterior. Her father had always moved with purpose, but this was different. This was decades of combat experience unleashed with precision and control. DC. Remaining gang members looked at each other uncertainly. Their phones, which had been so eagerly recording Sarah's humiliation, were now forgotten in their hands. They were beginning to realize that they had stumbled into something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. "You're making a big mistake," Viper warned, but he had backed away from Sarah, his earlier confidence evaporating in the face of real danger. "Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are," James replied, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles. "The question is, do you know who I am?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made the gang members pale, a set of Delta Force credentials, worn but unmistakable. "My name is Command Sergeant Major James Mitchell, retired," he stated, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I served 25 years with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. This cemetery holds the remains of men and women I fought beside, bled with, and watched die defending the very freedoms you're abusing." The effect was immediate. 2 of the gang members took several steps back, their faces draining of color. Even Viper, who had been so confident in his dominance moments before, seemed to shrink under James's steady gaze. Sarah watched as her father's presence transformed the entire atmosphere of the cemetery. The morning air, which had been filled with crude laughter and taunts, now crackled with tension. She could see the recognition in the gang members' eyes. They had unknowingly picked a fight with someone far beyond their capabilities. Delta Force? One of the younger gang members whispered, his voice trembling. Like the real Delta Force? Every painted headstone, James continued, ignoring the question. Every crushed flower, every drop of beer spilled on this sacred ground, it's all documented. He nodded toward Sarah, who finally held up her phone openly. My daughter made sure of that. Viper's face contorted with rage as he realized they'd been recorded. "Give me that phone!" he snarled, taking a step toward Sarah. James's movement was so fast it seemed almost casual. One moment he was standing several feet away. The next, he had Viper's arm twisted behind his back, forcing the gang leader to his knees. "That was your second mistake," James said calmly, applying just enough pressure to make Viper gasp. "Your first was touching my daughter. Your third will be if you don't listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." The remaining gang members stood frozen, their own phones now hanging limply at their sides. The man James had knocked down earlier had crawled back to his feet, but made no move to help his leader. "The thing about Delta Force," James continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that somehow made it more terrifying, "is that we never really retire. We maintain connections. Right now, for instance, every license plate on your motorcycles is being run through multiple databases. Your faces are being cross-referenced with law enforcement records across the state." Sarah stood up slowly, straightening her paint-stained uniform. She had seen glimpses of this side of her father before, but never so fully unveiled. The quiet, reserved man who gardened in Montana had transformed into something else entirely, a warrior defending his family and his fallen comrades. "Within the hour," James went on, "every law enforcement agency in a 100-mile radius will have your information. But more importantly, every veterans organization, every motorcycle club that respects the military, every person who believes in honoring our fallen, they'll know what you did here." Viper struggled briefly, but James's grip was like iron. "You can't," he started to say. "I can," James cut him off. "And I will, unless—" He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Unless what?" one of the other gang members asked, clearly looking for any way out of the situation. "Unless you make this right," James said. "Now. Starting with an apology to my daughter and a thorough cleaning of every headstone you defaced." Sarah watched. As the gang members looked at each other, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The man with the snake tattoo on his neck was the first to move, pulling cleaning supplies from his saddlebag. "I'm sorry," he muttered as he passed Sarah, unable to meet her eyes. "We didn't know." "That's the problem," James said, still holding Viper in place. "You never bothered to find out who you were dealing with. You never stopped to think about the consequences of disrespecting those who gave everything for this country." One by one, the gang members began cleaning the headstones they had defaced, working in silence under James's watchful eye. Sarah moved to stand beside her father, her phone still recording everything. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. James's lips curved in a slight smile, though his grip on Viper never loosened. "A father always knows when his little girl needs him. Plus, I had some business in the area. Thought I'd surprise you with a visit." His eyes hardened as he looked down at Viper. "Seems I had good timing." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the rows of white headstones. In the distance, birds had begun to sing again, their songs a sharp contrast to the sounds of the gang members working to undo their damage. The sacred peace of the cemetery was slowly being restored, but the morning's events had changed something fundamental in the air. "Look at me," James commanded Viper, his voice carrying the weight of countless battlefield orders. "I want you to understand exactly what happens next." He slowly released his grip, allowing the gang leader to turn and face him. Viper stood unsteadily, his earlier arrogance replaced by barely concealed fear. The other gang members had paused in their cleaning, watching the confrontation with bated breath. Sarah kept her phone steady, continuing to document everything. "You have two choices," James continued, his presence seeming to fill the entire cemetery. "The first is to leave here today, never return, and spend the rest of your lives trying to make up for what you've done. The second—" He let the sentence hang, his eyes hardening. "Well, let's just say you won't like the second choice." Several of the gang members had already begun nodding, eager to take the first option, but Viper, despite his obvious fear, seemed to be struggling with his wounded pride. "You think you can just threaten us?" He attempted to snarl, but his voice cracked. "We're the Crimson Serpents. We have connections too." James's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. "Connections? Let me tell you about connections." He pulled out his phone, pressed a few buttons, and held it up. "Right now, I'm on a conference call with 3 former Delta Force operators who run the largest veteran motorcycle clubs in the state. They're very interested in hearing about your activities here." As if on cue, deep voices emerged from the phone's speaker, their tones carrying the same hardened edge as James's. "We got their plates, Jim," one voice announced. "Running them now. Got some interesting hits already. Multiple warrants," another voice added. "Looks like our snake friends have been busy." Viper's face had gone completely white. The other gang members were looking at their bikes, clearly contemplating making a run for it. "Don't even think about it," James warned, reading their intentions. "The cemetery exits are already being watched. This can go one of two ways. You leave here peacefully after making amends, or you leave in handcuffs. Your choice." Sarah watched as the reality of their situation finally sank in. These men, who had felt so powerful terrorizing a lone nurse, were now faced with the full weight of military brotherhood bearing down on them. "What do you want us to do?" one of the younger gang members asked, his voice small. James gestured. "To the desecrated graves. You're going to clean every headstone you vandalized. You're going to replace every flower you destroyed. You're going to show the respect these heroes deserve." His eyes narrowed. "And then you're going to make a public apology." "A public apology?" Viper started to protest, but James cut him off. "You were brave enough to record yourselves attacking my daughter. Now you can be brave enough to record yourselves making amends." He turned to Sarah. "Keep that phone rolling, Butterfly. Let's make sure everyone sees this part too." The gang members worked in silence, scrubbing the paint from the white marble headstones. Their earlier bravado had been replaced by a subdued humility, especially when James made them read aloud the names of the veterans whose graves they had desecrated. "Private First Class Michael Torres," one would read. "Bronze Star Recipient, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Collins," another would announce. "Purple Heart." With each name, each medal, each life story, the gang members seemed to shrink further into themselves. The reality of their actions, the weight of the lives they had disrespected, began to settle on their shoulders. Finally, when the last headstone was cleaned and the fresh flowers had been carefully placed, James gathered them in front of Sarah's phone. "Now," he commanded, "apologize, not just to my daughter, but to every family member who has a loved one resting here, to every veteran who ever served, to every American who believes in honoring our fallen." One by one, the gang members faced the camera. Their apologies started out stilted, forced, but as they spoke, something seemed to shift in their expressions. Perhaps it was the presence of James, or maybe it was the gravity of the cemetery itself. But their words began to carry genuine remorse. Even Viper, when his turn came, couldn't maintain his tough facade. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What we did was wrong. We dishonored not just these graves, but everything they represent. I know words aren't enough, but they're a start," James finished for him. "Now, I believe it's time for you to leave, and remember, we'll be watching. Every veteran's cemetery, every memorial, every place that honors our fallen. We'll know if you step out of line again." The gang members nodded, thoroughly cowed. They mounted their motorcycles quietly, the engines starting with subdued rumbles, rather than their earlier aggressive roars. As they rode away, their taillights disappearing into the morning light, the cemetery seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The incident at Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours of Sarah uploading the video, it had been shared thousands of times. The footage was powerful, beginning with the gang's initial harassment, showing their desecration of the graves, and culminating in their humbling confrontation with James Mitchell. Comments flooded in from across the country, with veterans, military families, and civilians alike expressing their outrage at the Crimson Serpents' behavior and their admiration for Sarah and her father's stand against them. "This is what real courage looks like," wrote one veteran, "standing up for what's right, even when outnumbered. That nurse and her Delta Force dad are true American heroes." Local news stations picked up the story, their headlines capturing the public's imagination. Delta Force, veteran defends daughter and sacred ground from gang. Father-daughter duo stand against cemetery desecration. Retired Special Forces. Operator shows gang the true meaning of respect. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Veterans organizations reached out, asking her to speak at their events. Military families sent messages of gratitude, sharing stories of their own loved ones, buried in veterans' cemeteries across the country. The video had sparked a larger conversation about respect for military memorials and the importance of protecting sacred spaces. Social media was filled with images of people visiting veterans' cemeteries, laying flowers, and paying their respects. Back at the VA hospital where Sarah worked, her colleagues gathered around her, offering support and amazement at her courage. Many hadn't known about her father's military background, and the revelation added a new dimension to their understanding of her dedication to veteran care. "I can't believe you stood up to them like that," her friend Lisa, another nurse, said, during their break. "I mean, 5 against 1, and you didn't back down." Sarah touched the dog tags beneath her fresh scrubs, a habit that had become even more meaningful since the incident. "I couldn't let them disrespect the graves like that. These veterans gave everything for our country. The least we can do is protect their final resting place." The hospital administration had called her into a meeting that morning, not to reprimand her, but to commend her actions. They were implementing new security measures at nearby veterans' memorials, inspired by the incident. "Your story has sparked a movement, Ms. Mitchell," the hospital director had told her. "People are paying attention to these sacred spaces in a way they haven't before." But it wasn't just the positive attention that was spreading. The Crimson Serpents were facing serious consequences. Their filmed confession and the evidence of their vandalism had led to multiple arrests. Veteran motorcycle clubs across the state had put out warnings about them, effectively limiting their ability to operate in the area. Local law enforcement, embarrassed by their previous inability to curb the gang's activities, had launched a full investigation into their other crimes. The dominoes were falling, all because they had picked the wrong nurse to harass at the wrong cemetery. James had remained in town, his planned surprise visit extended by the aftermath of the incident. He sat with Sarah in her small apartment, watching the story unfold across multiple news channels. "I never wanted this kind of attention," Sarah admitted, curled up on her couch with a cup of tea. "I just wanted to protect the cemetery." James smiled, the hardened Delta Force operator once again replaced by her gentle father. "Sometimes standing up for what's right puts you in the spotlight, Butterfly. The important thing is how you use that platform." And she was using it. Sarah had already scheduled meetings with veterans groups to discuss organizing regular patrols of military cemeteries. She was working with the VA hospital to create a program connecting veteran patients with local memorial sites, helping them find peace and purpose in maintaining these sacred spaces. The impact rippled beyond their local community. Veterans' cemeteries across the country reported an increase in volunteers offering to help maintain the grounds. Young people were reaching out, asking how they could get involved in protecting these memorial sites. "Your mother would be proud," James said quietly, watching his daughter coordinate another volunteer meeting on her phone. "She always said you had her heart and my spirit." Sarah paused, thinking of her mother's grave in the cemetery, the fresh flowers she had placed there before the confrontation. "Do you think I did the right thing, Dad? Standing up to them like that?" James leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You did more than the right thing, Sarah. You showed them that these aren't just stones in the ground. These are monuments to courage, to sacrifice, to everything that makes this country great. You defended not just the physical space, but the meaning behind it." Outside, the sun was setting on another day, casting long shadows across the city. Somewhere out there, 5 members of the Crimson Serpents were learning hard lessons about respect and consequences. But more importantly, thousands of people were reconsidering their relationship with these sacred spaces, these final resting places of American heroes. The transformation of Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery in the weeks following. The incident was remarkable. What had once been a quiet, sometimes overlooked sacred space had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of resilience and respect that drew visitors from across the state. Sarah stood at the entrance one Sunday morning, watching as volunteers arrived for the weekly maintenance program she had helped organize. Veterans in their service caps worked alongside civilians, teaching them the proper way to care for the headstones. Children followed behind with flowers, learning the stories of the heroes buried there. The scene before her was a far cry from that tense morning with the Crimson Serpents. The air, once filled with the harsh roar of their motorcycles and cruel laughter, now carried the gentle murmur of respectful conversations and occasional military hymns sung by visiting choirs. "Quite a change, isn't it?" a familiar voice said beside her. Sarah turned to find her father, dressed in his casual clothes but still carrying himself with that unmistakable military bearing. He had extended his stay indefinitely, taking up residence in a small apartment nearby. "I never imagined it would turn out like this," Sarah admitted, watching as a group of young scouts carefully placed flags beside each headstone. "I was just trying to protect the cemetery." James smiled, his weathered face softening. "Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest ripples, Butterfly. Look there." He nodded toward a group of bikers pulling into the parking lot. On their motorcycles. These weren't serpents, though. These were members of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance, a group of former service members who had taken it upon themselves to become unofficial guardians of military cemeteries across the state. Their bikes gleamed in the morning sun, decorated with American flags and military branch insignias. "Morning, Command Sergeant Major!" one of them called out, offering a crisp salute as he dismounted. James returned it with practiced precision. The Alliance had become a regular presence at the cemetery, their members taking shifts to ensure no one else would dare disrespect the grounds. They had even started a mentorship program, reaching out to troubled youth in the area to teach them about military history and the importance of honoring veterans. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from the VA hospital. Since the incident, she had been promoted to head of veteran outreach, coordinating programs between the hospital and various military memorial sites. Her unique perspective as both a nurse and the daughter of a Delta Force operator had made her invaluable in bridging the gap between medical care and veteran support. "Miss Mitchell," a young voice called out. Sarah turned to see Emma, a local girl who had become a regular volunteer. She was holding a bouquet of fresh flowers. "Can you help me find my grandpa's grave? I want to tell him about my history project on Vietnam." Sarah smiled, taking the girl's hand. This was another change. Families weren't just visiting to mourn anymore. They were coming to share, to teach, to keep the memories of their loved ones alive in meaningful ways. As they walked through the rows of headstones, Sarah noticed how immaculate they were kept now. The community's renewed commitment to maintaining the cemetery had transformed it into a shining example of how to honor fallen heroes. "Your grandpa would be proud of you," Sarah told Emma as they reached the grave. "He fought so you could have the freedom to learn and grow." The girl nodded solemnly, placing her flowers with careful precision. "Did you know him?" she asked. "Like you knew the soldiers whose graves those bad men hurt?" Sarah knelt beside her, touched by the innocence of the question. "I didn't know him personally, but I know what he stood for. All these veterans, they're part of one big family. When you serve your country, you become part of something bigger than yourself." As if to emphasize her point, the rumble of motorcycles in the distance announced the arrival of more Veterans Alliance members. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them rode former members of the Crimson Serpents, their bikes no longer bearing gang insignias, but instead carrying American flags. The transformation of some gang members had been one of the most unexpected outcomes of the incident. After their humbling encounter with James, a few of the younger ones had reached out, seeking a way to make genuine amends. The Veterans Alliance had taken them under their wing, showing them a different kind of brotherhood, one built on honor rather than intimidation. Sarah watched as they parked their bikes and joined the volunteer groups, their faces showing the same respect that had been forced from them weeks ago. Now it came naturally, born of understanding rather than fear. "The father's quite the mentor," one of the Alliance leaders said, approaching Sarah. "He's got those boys learning military history, helping with cemetery maintenance, even talking about joining the service themselves." James, who had followed Sarah and Emma, smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need to be shown a better path. These grounds, these memories, they have a way of changing perspectives." The mourning continued, with volunteers working together to maintain the sacred space. Sarah moved among them, sharing stories of the veterans she cared for at the hospital, helping families find their loved ones' graves, and ensuring that every headstone received the attention it deserved. The local news had arrived to do a follow-up story on the cemetery's transformation. Sarah watched as they interviewed volunteers, captured footage of the community coming together, and spoke with veterans about the importance of protecting these hallowed grounds. "And what about the Crimson Serpents?" the reporter asked her. "Did you ever expect your stand against them would lead to all this?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. What happened that morning wasn't just about stopping vandalism. It was about reminding people that these aren't just stones in a field. Each one represents a life given in service to our country. When you understand that, really understand it, you can't help but want to protect and honor them. The reporter nodded, gesturing to the former gang members working alongside veterans. "And them, what do you think about their change of heart?" "It proves what my father always taught me," Sarah replied, watching as they listened intently to an older veteran, describing his service. "Sometimes people do the wrong thing because they've never been shown the right way. These grounds, these stories, these sacrifices, they have a power to change hearts when we take the time to understand them." As the day drew to a close, Sarah stood with her father at her mother's grave. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds, but unlike that fateful morning, these shadows held no threat, only peace and respect. "Your mother would be amazed," James said softly, placing a fresh flower on the headstone. "Not just at what you did, but at what you helped create here." Sarah leaned against her father's shoulder, watching as the last volunteers packed up their tools and said their goodbyes. The cemetery had become more than just a final resting place. It was now a living memorial, a place where the past connected with the present, where lessons were learned and respect was earned. The transformation hadn't just been in the physical space or in the reformed gang members. It was in the community itself, in the way people now viewed these sacred grounds. What had started as one nurse's stand against disrespect had grown into a movement of understanding, honor, and active remembrance. As twilight settled over Arlington Heights, Sarah touched her father's dog tags, still hanging beneath her shirt. They were a constant reminder not just of his service, but of the responsibility they all shared to protect and honor those who had given everything for their country. The cemetery was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet. The silence of respect, of remembrance, of promises kept and lessons learned. In the distance, a bugler began playing taps, the mournful notes floating across the rows of white stones, each one a testament to sacrifice, each one now protected by a community that had finally understood their true meaning. 6 months after the incident at Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery, the ripple effects continued to spread across the nation. Sarah sat in her office at the VA hospital, reviewing the latest reports from the National Veterans Memorial Protection Initiative, a program that had grown from the seeds of that confrontation with the Crimson Serpents. Her computer screen displayed messages from veterans' cemeteries across the country, each reporting similar transformations. Communities had rallied around these sacred spaces, establishing volunteer programs, security patrols, and educational initiatives. What had started as one nurse's stand against disrespect had evolved into a nationwide movement. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, looking up to find her father standing there, dressed in his familiar leather riding jacket. "Ready for the ceremony?" James asked, his eyes twinkling with pride. Today marked the official dedication of the Arlington Heights Memorial Gardens, a new section of the cemetery designed specifically for community engagement and education. Sarah nodded, gathering her notes for the speech she would deliver. The past 6 months had transformed her from a quiet nurse into a vocal advocate for veterans' rights and memorial protection. Her story had resonated with people across the country, inspiring similar acts of courage and commitment. As they walked through the hospital corridors, staff and patients alike greeted them with respect. Many of the veterans she treated had become regular volunteers at the cemetery, finding purpose and healing in maintaining the grounds and sharing their stories with visitors. "Did you see the latest news about Viper?" James asked as they reached his motorcycle in the parking lot. Sarah had grown comfortable riding with her father, the experience now feeling like a natural extension of their strengthened bond. She nodded, securing her helmet. The former gang leader had made headlines recently, but not for his usual criminal activities. After serving time for the cemetery vandalism, he had undergone a remarkable transformation. Now, he worked with at-risk youth, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about respect and redemption. "He's speaking at the ceremony today," Sarah replied as they rode through the morning traffic. "Some of the families were hesitant about it, but I think it's important. His story shows that change is possible when people understand the true meaning of sacrifice." The cemetery came into view, but it was barely recognizable from that fateful morning 6 months ago. The entrance now featured a beautiful arch, decorated with military service seals and the words, "Honor, Respect, Remember," in gleaming letters. The parking lot was full of cars and motorcycles, many bearing veteran license plates or military branch decals. As they parked, Sarah noticed a group of young men in leather vests, former serpents who had followed Viper's lead toward redemption. They were helping to set up chairs for the ceremony, working alongside Veterans Alliance members with an ease that would have seemed impossible half a year ago. The new memorial garden spread out before them, a thoughtfully designed space that combined traditional cemetery elements with areas for education and reflection. A circular plaza featured monuments explaining different military conflicts, while peaceful paths wound between the graves, each lined with plaques sharing veterans' stories. "Ms. Mitchell!" several voices called out as Sarah and James made their way toward the ceremony area. A group of school children rushed over, each carrying small American flags. They were part of the new Junior Veterans Honor Guard, a program Sarah had helped establish to teach young people about military service and sacrifice. "Are you going to tell the story again?" one boy asked eagerly. "About how you and your dad stood up to the bad guys?" Sarah smiled, kneeling to meet their eyes. "Today we're going to hear lots of stories," she explained. "Stories about courage, about respect, and about how we can all make a difference in protecting these sacred spaces." The ceremony area had filled quickly. Local officials sat alongside veteran organization leaders. Hospital staff mingled with military families. Even some national news crews had shown up to cover the event, recognizing its significance in the larger narrative of veteran memorial protection. As Sarah took her place at the podium, she felt the weight of her father's dog tags against her chest. She wore them now not just as a connection to him, but as a symbol of the responsibility they all shared in honoring those who had served. "6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "this cemetery witnessed an act of disrespect that could have left us angry and divided. Instead, it became the catalyst for something extraordinary, a reminder that these grounds are more than just a final resting place. They are a bridge between generations, a testament to sacrifice, and a call to action for all of us." She gestured to the transformed space around them. "Look at what we've created together. Veterans finding purpose in sharing their stories, young people learning the true meaning of service, former adversaries working side by side to protect these sacred grounds. This is what happens when we choose to honor our heroes, not just with words, but with actions." Viper stepped forward when she called him, his face showing none of its former arrogance. He spoke about transformation, about understanding the true meaning of brotherhood through the veterans who had given him a second chance. His words carried the weight of genuine remorse and the promise of continued change. The ceremony continued with the dedication of new features: a meditation garden for veterans dealing with PTSD, an interactive historical display for students, and a wall of honor listing every service member laid to rest within the grounds. Each element had been carefully designed to create not just a memorial, but a living space for learning and healing. As the formal proceedings concluded, Sarah watched families spread out across the grounds. Children sat with veterans, listening to stories of service and sacrifice. Former gang members led tours, their knowledge of military history now as impressive as their former reputation had been intimidating. "You've created something special." "A butterfly," James said, standing beside her. "Something that will outlast all of us." Sarah shook her head. "We all created this, Dad. Every person who stood up and said these grounds deserve respect, every volunteer who gave their time, every veteran who shared their story, even those who started as our opponents but found a better path." The afternoon. Sun cast long shadows across the white headstones. But unlike that tense morning 6 months ago, these shadows held no menace. They were simply a reminder of time's passage, of the importance of preserving memories and passing on lessons learned. A bugler began playing in the distance, the notes of "Amazing Grace" floating across the grounds. Visitors stopped to listen, many placing hands over hearts. In that moment, Sarah realized that their story had become part of something larger, a reminder that sacred spaces survive through the dedication of those who understand their true value. As the last notes faded away, Sarah touched her father's dog tags once more. The metal was warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the legacy she helped protect. The cemetery had become more than just her Sunday morning ritual. It was now a symbol of transformation, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, and a promise to future generations that sacrifice would never be forgotten. 1 year after the confrontation at Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the National Veterans Memorial Convention. In Washington, D.C., her journey from small-town VA nurse to nationally recognized advocate for veterans' memorial protection had been remarkable, but she remained grounded in her original purpose, honoring those who had served. "When I faced those gang members that morning," she began, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room, "I wasn't thinking about starting a movement. I was thinking about every veteran I'd ever cared for, every family member who'd ever wept at a loved one's grave, every sacrifice that those headstones represented. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage ripple out in ways we never expect." The audience sat transfixed as she shared the story they'd all heard but never tired of hearing. Veterans, military families, and memorial protection advocates from across the country had gathered to learn from what had become known as the Arlington Heights model, a comprehensive approach to protecting and revitalizing veterans' memorials. James sat in the front row, his presence as commanding as ever. Beside him sat several members of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance, including some former Serpents who had become the program's most passionate advocates. Their transformation had become a powerful testament to the possibility of change. "The true victory," Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide in her presentation, "wasn't in stopping one act of vandalism. It was in creating a sustainable model for community engagement with these sacred spaces. When people understand the stories behind the stones, they become more than observers, they become guardians." The screen displayed images of various programs that had grown from their initial stand: the Junior Veterans Honor Guard, now active in schools across the country; the Memorial Protection Rider Network, coordinating motorcycle clubs to provide security at veterans' cemeteries; the Veterans Story Project, documenting the lives of those laid to rest in these hallowed grounds. But perhaps the most powerful outcome, Sarah said, nodding toward the former gang members, has been watching people find their way back to honor through these programs. When we stand up for what's right, we don't just protect physical spaces, we create opportunities for redemption. After her speech, Sarah found herself surrounded by conference attendees, eager to implement similar programs in their communities. She shared contact information, promised resources, and encouraged them to adapt the model to their local needs. "Ms. Mitchell," a young veteran approached her, leaning heavily on a cane. "Your story inspired me to start a program at our local cemetery. The teenagers who used to vandalize the place now help me maintain it. They're learning about sacrifice, about honor. Some are even talking about enlisting." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. Hearing how their stand against disrespect had sparked positive changes across the nation. The incident with the Crimson Serpents had become more than just a confrontation. It had become a catalyst for transformation. Later that evening, Sarah joined her father and a group of veterans for dinner at a nearby restaurant. The conversation flowed easily, mixing stories of service with plans for expanding their memorial protection initiatives. "You know what amazes me most?" One of the former Serpents, now clean-cut and wearing a Veterans Alliance patch, spoke up. "A year ago, I thought power meant making people fear you. Now I understand that real power comes from earning their respect." James nodded approvingly. "That's the lesson we try to teach through these programs. It's not about authority or force. It's about understanding the value of sacrifice and the importance of protecting its memory. Sarah listened to the conversations around her, marveling at how far they'd come. The VA hospital where she worked had become a model for integrating memorial protection into veteran care. Patients found healing in maintaining the grounds, sharing their stories, and mentoring younger generations. Her phone buzzed with a message. Another cemetery requesting guidance on implementing their protection program. The movement had grown, beyond anything she could have imagined that morning, a year ago, when she stood alone against disrespect. "You know what's really remarkable?" she said to her father as they walked back to their hotel later that night. "It's not just about protecting memorials anymore. We're building bridges between generations, between communities. We're helping people find purpose in preserving these sacred spaces." James smiled, the streetlights reflecting off his silver hair. "That's what true service is about, Butterfly. It's not just about standing guard. It's about creating something that outlasts, or something that carries the memory of sacrifice forward." The next morning, Sarah stood at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, running her fingers over the engraved names. A group of junior honor guard members was nearby, learning about the conflict from a veteran who had served there. "Each name has a story," the veteran was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what these kids need to understand. These aren't just letters carved in stone. They're lives given for our freedom." Sarah watched as the children listened intently, their young faces serious and respectful. This was the future they were building. A generation that understood the true meaning of memorial grounds, that would carry forward the legacy of protection and respect. Later, during the conference's closing ceremony, Sarah was presented with the National Veterans Memorial Protection Award. As she accepted it, she spoke not of her own actions, but of the collective effort that had transformed one morning's stand against disrespect into a nationwide movement. "This award belongs to everyone who understood that sacred spaces need more than physical protection," she said. "They need active remembrance, ongoing education, and committed guardians. They need communities willing to stand up and say, 'Not here, not ever.'" The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for every volunteer, every veteran, every reformed former gang member who had found purpose in protecting these hallowed grounds. It was for the transformative power of understanding, respect, and dedication to something greater than oneself. As Sarah and James flew home the next day, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The confrontation at Arlington Heights had been just the beginning, a spark that had ignited a nationwide recommitment to protecting veterans' memorials. "Did you ever think," she asked her father, "that standing up to those bikers would lead to all this?" James looked at her with pride. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. You taught me that, Butterfly." Sarah touched her father's dog tags, still hanging beneath her blouse. They had become more than just a family connection. They were a symbol of the responsibility they all shared in protecting the memory of those who had served. The movement they had started would continue to grow, spreading from cemetery to cemetery, community to community, generation to generation. What had begun as one nurse's stand against disrespect had become a lasting legacy of protection, education, and honor for America's fallen heroes. In the quiet dawn of another Sunday morning, 5 years after the confrontation that had changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of Arlington Heights Veterans Memorial Cemetery. The years had brought wisdom to her face, but her dedication remained unchanged. She watched as the morning mist rolled between the pristine rows of white headstones, each one a testament to sacrifice, each one now protected by a community that understood their true value. The cemetery had become a national model, its transformation complete yet ever evolving. Where once there had been neglect and vulnerability, now there was constant activity. Veterans sharing stories, children learning history, families finding healing in the sacred space. The grounds had expanded, now including educational centers, memorial gardens and quiet spaces for reflection. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," called out a familiar voice. Viper, now known by his real name, Michael, approached on foot, his leather vest bearing the emblem of the Veterans Memorial Protection. Alliance. The years had changed him too, erasing the angry swagger and replacing it with a dignified bearing that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Early patrol?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer. The former gang leader had become one of the cemetery's most dedicated guardians, his past serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the possibility of change. "Always," he replied, gesturing to a group of young riders arriving on motorcycles. "Training the new generation. Most of them are children of veterans. They understand what these grounds mean." Sarah watched as the young riders dismounted, their bikes customized not with gang symbols, but with American flags and military branch insignias. They gathered around Michael, listening intently as he began their morning briefing on cemetery protocol and the importance of their mission. The sound of another motorcycle drew her attention. Her father, James, silver hair, now completely white but his bearing still unmistakably military, pulled up on his familiar bike. Age had done nothing to diminish his presence. If anything, the years had only enhanced the quiet authority he carried. "Ready for the anniversary ceremony?" he asked, dismounting with the fluid grace that spoke of his Delta Force training. Today marked 5 years since their confrontation with the Serpents, an event now commemorated annually as a reminder of the importance of protecting sacred spaces. "Almost," Sarah replied, touching the dog tags that still hung beneath her scrubs. She now divided her time between the VA hospital and directing the National Veterans Memorial Protection Program, a responsibility that had grown from their local stand against disrespect into a nationwide movement. The morning unfolded with practiced precision as volunteers and visitors began arriving. The transformation of the cemetery was evident in every detail, from the meticulously maintained grounds to the educational plaques that shared veterans' stories. The memorial gardens, once just an idea, now bloomed with carefully chosen flowers, each variety selected to honor different branches of service. "Miss Mitchell," called out a teenage girl, hurrying over with a group of junior honor guards. "We finished the new veteran interview project. 20 more stories documented for the digital archive." Sarah smiled, remembering how the program had started with just a handful of kids wanting to learn about the veterans buried here. Now it was a nationwide initiative, with young people across the country recording and preserving the stories of those laid to rest in veterans' cemeteries. The anniversary ceremony brought together people from all walks of life, veterans and their families, community leaders, reformed former gang members, and countless others who had been touched by the movement that began here. They gathered in the central plaza, surrounded by monuments that told the story of service and sacrifice. As Sarah took her place at the podium, she saw faces both familiar and new in the crowd. Some had been there that morning 5 years ago, while others had joined the cause after hearing about their stand against disrespect. All were now part of something larger than themselves. "5 years ago," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "this cemetery witnessed a confrontation that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it became the birthplace of a movement that has transformed how we protect and honor our veterans' memorials." She gestured to the former gang members, now proud members of the Veterans Memorial Protection Alliance. "We learned that change is possible when people understand the true meaning of these sacred grounds. We discovered that even those who once showed disrespect could become the most dedicated guardians when given the chance to understand what these stones represent. The ceremony included testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the program. Veterans spoke of finding healing in maintaining the grounds. Young people shared what they had learned from recording veterans' stories. Former troublemakers described how protecting the cemetery had given them purpose and direction. James took the podium to speak about the nationwide impact of their initial stand. The Arlington Heights model had been adopted by veterans' cemeteries across the country, each adapting it to their local needs while maintaining the core principles of education, protection, and community engagement. What happened here 5 years ago, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, wasn't just about stopping vandalism. It was about remembering that these grounds are sacred, that each stone represents a life given in service to our country. When we protect these memorials, we protect more than just monuments. We protect the memory of sacrifice itself. After the formal ceremony, people spread out across the grounds, participating in various activities that had become tradition. Veterans led tours, sharing stories of service and sacrifice. Children placed flags and flowers at graves, learning the importance of remembrance. Former gang members, now mentors, taught young riders about respect and responsibility. Sarah walked with her father through the rows of headstones, eventually stopping at her mother's grave. The years had not diminished the power of this place, nor the importance of their mission to protect it. "Your mother would be proud," James said softly, placing a fresh flower on the headstone. "Not just of what you did that morning, but of what you've helped create here," Sarah nodded, thinking of how far they had come. The cemetery was no longer just a final resting place. It had become a living memorial, a center of education and healing, a symbol of transformation and redemption. As the day drew to a close, the traditional sunset ceremony began. A bugler played taps while members of the Junior Honor Guard lowered the flag with careful precision. The notes floated across the grounds, reminding all present of the sacrifices honored here. Sarah stood with her father, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the white headstones in shades of gold. The fear and anger of that morning 5 years ago had been transformed into something powerful and lasting. A movement that would continue to grow, protecting sacred spaces and honoring fallen heroes for generations to come. The legacy they had created went beyond physical protection. It was about understanding, respect, and active remembrance. It was about turning confrontation into transformation, fear into understanding, and disrespect into dedicated service. As twilight settled over Arlington Heights, Sarah touched her father's dog tags one final time. They were more than just metal now. They were a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, of the possibility of change, and of the enduring importance of protecting the memory of those who gave everything for their country. If you enjoyed this powerful story about Sarah and her father's courageous stand to protect veterans' sacred grounds, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share inspiring stories that remind us of the importance of standing up for what's right and honoring those who've served our country. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to never miss our upcoming stories of courage, transformation, and the enduring power of respect. Join our community as we continue to share tales that touch hearts and change lives. Would you like me to give this closing call to action a different style or tone?